Sandra Bullock had always been one of those stars who valued simplicity more than glamour. Even though she had achieved worldwide fame and had starred in countless blockbuster films, she often tried to live her life away from the flashing cameras and screaming crowds. On this particular evening, she wanted nothing more than to enjoy a peaceful dinner. Far away from the chaos of Hollywood, the sun had just set, and Los Angeles was glowing with its usual mix of city lights and soft evening breezes. Sandra, dressed casually in a light jacket and jeans, blended into the atmosphere almost perfectly. She wasn't trying to make an entrance or draw attention to herself. She was simply a woman looking for a quiet moment. The restaurant she chose that night was known not just for its delicious food, but also for the kind of atmosphere that attracted people who wanted to relax. It wasn't one of those flashy places where paparazzi crowded outside waiting for pictures. Instead, it had dim lighting, wooden interiors, and a warmth that made people feel at home the moment they walked in. Sandra liked that about the place. She could sit at a corner table and feel like just another customer, not a world-famous actress when she entered. A few diners recognized her but chose not to disturb her. Most people respected her space because Sandra had always carried herself with humility. She smiled politely when she caught someone's eye, and then settled at her table near the window. From her seat, she could see the street outside where cars passed by slowly, and inside, the soft background music gave the restaurant a calm rhythm. It was exactly the kind of evening she had imagined for herself. Sandra picked up the menu and looked through it with interest. She wasn't one to fuss over fancy dishes. In fact, she loved comfort food the most. A good bowl of pasta or a fresh salad with warm bread was enough to make her happy. Tonight, she thought about trying something new but also wanted to keep things simple. She gently placed the menu back on the table and waited for the waiter to come by. The first few moments were peaceful. Sandra glanced around and noticed couples laughing quietly over shared meals, friends catching up after long weeks, and a family with 2 children enjoying dinner together. It made her heart warm, because it reminded her that despite all the glamour of Hollywood, these simple joys were what life was truly about. She pulled out her phone for a moment, not to scroll endlessly, but to check a message from Keanu Reeves, her longtime friend. He had promised to join her later for dinner, and just knowing he was on his way made her smile as she waited. She sipped on the glass of water the staff had placed on the table. The cold liquid was refreshing, and she closed her eyes for a brief second. Breathing in the calmness of the evening, this was her idea of happiness. No spotlight, no red carpet, just a moment where she could be herself. She had spent so many years in the public eye, always having to appear perfect, always being judged for what she wore or how she spoke. But in this restaurant, at this hour, she wasn't Sandra Bullock, the superstar. She was simply Sandra, a woman who wanted peace every now and then. She thought about how fame was both a gift and a burden. On one hand, it gave her incredible opportunities. It allowed her to inspire millions, to bring stories to life, to make people laugh and cry through the screen. On the other hand, it took away her privacy. People often forgot that she too was human, that she too had days when she just wanted to eat a meal without anyone noticing her. That was why she loved places like this restaurant, where respect was part of the culture. Sandra leaned back in her chair and took in the cozy atmosphere again. The smell of roasted garlic and herbs floated through the air from the kitchen, reminding her of her grandmother's cooking. She tapped her fingers lightly on the table in rhythm with the music, a small habit she had whenever she felt content. For a brief moment, she forgot about everything else. The scripts waiting to be read, the interviews lined up for next week, the endless demands of her career. It was just her, the warm light of the restaurant, and the promise of a quiet dinner. Little did she know, this calm beginning was about to take a sharp turn. The evening she had hoped would stay peaceful would soon turn into something entirely different. But for now, Sandra allowed herself to enjoy the silence, believing she had found a safe pocket of peace in the middle of her busy life. She had no idea that her patience, her dignity, and even her friendship with Keanu Reeves would soon be tested in ways she did not expect. Sandra sat at her table, quietly enjoying the peaceful atmosphere of the restaurant. She believed the night would continue smoothly. But sometimes life has a way of surprising even those who least expect it. The first sign came when the waiter approached her table. Instead of greeting her with warmth or the usual polite smile, his face showed little interest, as if he were already tired of dealing with her. He placed the menu in front of her with a careless hand. Almost dropping it on the table, Sandra lifted her eyes to meet his. Offering her usual gentle smile, she said thank you in her soft tone. hoping to create a friendly exchange. But the waiter only nodded without saying a word. His eyes shifted quickly away from her, and he stood with a posture that seemed impatient. Sandra could feel the difference immediately. She had dined in many places before, and she knew when someone was treating her coldly. She wondered why he seemed so distant. Perhaps he was having a bad day, or maybe he was just new and nervous. She tried not to assume the worst when she ordered her drink. The waiter didn't even write it down. He simply muttered under his breath, almost as if repeating her words annoyed him. Then he walked away, leaving her sitting in a strange silence. Sandra noticed a couple at the table beside her had received a much warmer greeting. The same waiter had smiled at them, cracked a light joke, and even recommended a dish from the menu. The difference in behavior was so clear it was impossible to ignore. At first, Sandra brushed it off. She was not the type to create drama or demand special treatment. She valued kindness, but she also believed in patience. Maybe the waiter just needed time to settle into his shift. Still, there was a small sting in her heart. It wasn't about being famous or expecting privilege, it was about basic respect, something every person deserves no matter who they are. As the minutes passed, the waiter returned with her drink. He placed the glass on the table with a little too much force, causing the water to spill slightly onto the napkin. Sandra quickly grabbed it to stop the liquid from spreading. She looked up again, ready to tell him it was all right. But before she could, he had already walked away, not even offering an apology. The people around her began to notice. A family at the far end of the room glanced in her direction, curious about why the waiter seemed so unfriendly toward her. One older man shook his head slightly, as if disappointed by what he saw. Sandra felt the eyes on her, but she kept her composure. She had always believed that dignity meant not letting small moments break your calm. Still inside, she could not help but feel hurt. She reminded herself that she had been through tougher situations. Hollywood was filled with challenges much harsher than a rude waiter. Yet this moment felt different. It wasn't about critics writing reviews or strangers spreading gossip in magazines. It was about being treated unfairly in a place where she only wanted peace. Sandra picked up her glass and took a sip, letting the cool water calm her nerves. She told herself not to let it ruin her evening. Keanu would be arriving soon, and she wanted to focus on that. But fate seemed to have other plans when the waiter returned to take her food order. His tone was sharp, almost dismissive. He asked quickly, as though he wanted her to finish speaking so he could move on. Sandra ordered politely, choosing a simple pasta dish. His response was a sigh and a curt "all right." Before walking away again, she could hear the whisper of his shoes against the floor. Moving faster toward another table where his voice turned cheerful once more, Sandra sat back, her heart heavy. She couldn't understand why he had singled her out for such treatment. She thought about whether he held some personal grudge against celebrities. Or maybe he just assumed she was difficult, though she had done nothing but smile and speak kindly. She looked down at the menu one last time, even though her order had already been taken, and tried to push away the growing discomfort. Around her, the restaurant continued its normal rhythm. People laughed, forks clinked against plates, and the soft music floated in the air. Yet for Sandra, everything felt different now. The warmth she had experienced when she first walked in was slowly disappearing, replaced by an invisible tension that grew heavier with each interaction. She could feel her patience being tested, something that rarely happened to her. And then, almost as if to make matters worse, the waiter passed by her table again, muttering something under his breath, loud enough for Sandra and a few others to hear. The words were unclear, but the tone was filled with annoyance. It was as if he wanted people to notice his disdain. Sandra froze for a moment, her hand still resting on the table. She heard a couple nearby shift in their seats, whispering softly to each other. They too had caught the tone. Sandra took a deep breath, reminding herself that she did not need to respond. She had always believed that silence could be more powerful than confrontation. Still, she could not shake off the sting of disrespect. What was supposed to be a quiet evening had now become something else entirely. She was no longer just waiting for dinner. She was enduring a situation she had not invited, one that made her feel small in a place where she had come to feel free. What Sandra did not know was that this uncomfortable moment was only the beginning, because soon Keanu Reeves would walk through the door, and the night would take a turn that no one in the restaurant could ever forget. Sandra sat quietly at her table, trying her best to keep calm. She was used to ignoring negativity, but the way the waiter treated her was becoming more obvious with every passing minute. At first, she thought it might just be her imagination. But now even the people around her seemed to notice. The air inside the restaurant began to change, as if everyone could feel the uncomfortable energy spreading from one corner to the other. The waiter returned with her plate of food. He placed it down quickly, without the usual warmth or the simple courtesy of saying, "Enjoy your meal." Instead, he slid the plate across the table, causing the fork to rattle against the porcelain. A few drops of sauce spilled onto the table. Sandra gave a polite nod and softly said thank you. But the waiter had already turned his back and walked away. The diners nearby exchanged glances. They had seen enough to realize this wasn't just poor service. It was targeted behavior. A young woman whispered to her partner, wondering why the staff member was being so cold toward Sandra. Another man shook his head in disbelief. Sandra, feeling the attention on her, tried to stay composed. She picked up her fork and began eating slowly, pretending not to notice the whispers, but deep inside her heart was sinking. She was not a stranger to criticism. In Hollywood, she had faced rude reporters, gossip columns, and paparazzi who had followed her everywhere. But this situation felt different. It wasn't about her fame, it was about dignity. Every person, famous or not, deserved respect when they walked into a restaurant. Yet here she was, sitting quietly, being made to feel unwelcome. As Sandra took a bite of her food, she noticed the waiter hovering nearby, chatting cheerfully with another table. He laughed with them, recommended dishes, and even bent down to make sure their glasses were filled perfectly. His friendliness was undeniable, but the moment his eyes flicked back to Sandra's table, his face hardened again. The contrast was impossible to ignore. It was almost as if he wanted her to feel the difference, as if he was making a point. Sandra's stomach tightened. The food on her plate, though beautifully prepared, suddenly tasted bland. She tried to focus on the meal, but the tension in the room distracted her. A few diners kept looking at her sympathetically, their eyes saying what their mouths couldn't. They could see she was being treated unfairly, and it made them uncomfortable too. The moment that truly broke the silence came when Sandra asked politely for a refill of water. The waiter looked at her with a sharp expression and muttered, "You'll have to wait, I'm busy with other guests." His voice wasn't loud, but loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. A hush fell across the room. People stopped mid-conversation. Shocked at the bluntness of his response, Sandra froze. She didn't want to embarrass herself or create a scene, so she lowered her eyes to the table. Her fingers traced the edge of her napkin as if to keep herself grounded. She could feel her cheeks grow warm, not from anger but from the sting of humiliation. She wondered why someone would go out of their way to treat her this way when she had done nothing wrong. The waiter walked away again, leaving her sitting in silence. The diners nearby shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A family with children tried to focus on their meal, but even they whispered to each other about what had just happened. The tension had grown so thick that it felt like everyone was waiting for something, anything to break it. Sandra tried to remind herself of who she was. She had built a career on resilience, on facing challenges with grace. She told herself that this moment was temporary, that she didn't need to let one person's behavior ruin her evening. Yet inside, she couldn't deny the disappointment. She had come here for peace, and instead, she felt singled out and judged. As she pushed her food gently around her plate, she noticed her phone buzz. It was a message from Keanu Reeves saying he was on his way. For the first time that evening, a small wave of relief washed over her. Keanu was not just a friend. He was someone who always carried calmness wherever he went. She knew his presence would change the atmosphere still. She wondered how he would react if he saw the way she was being treated. The restaurant, meanwhile, had become unusually quiet. People continued eating, but their eyes kept drifting toward Sandra's table. Everyone sensed that the situation had reached a boiling point. The tension was no longer just between Sandra and the waiter. It had spread across the entire room. The waiter's sharp tone had pulled everyone into the moment, and now all eyes were waiting to see what would happen next. Sandra lifted her glass and finished the last sip of water. Her throat felt dry, but she didn't want to ask again. She chose silence instead, holding on to her dignity. She told herself that sometimes silence speaks louder than words. Yet she also knew this was not the end. Because once Keanu walked through that door, the story of the evening would change forever. The door of the restaurant opened gently, and in walked Keanu Reeves. His presence was calm yet strong, the kind that made people turn their heads without even realizing it. He wasn't dressed to impress, just in his usual simple style, dark jacket, worn jeans, and boots that looked comfortable rather than fashionable. That was Keanu, never trying to be flashy, never trying to stand out, but somehow always commanding attention. Sandra, still sitting at her table with a half-finished plate of pasta in front of her, felt her heart lighten the moment she saw him. She raised her hand slightly, giving him a small wave. He smiled warmly, the kind of smile that carried reassurance without needing words. He walked toward her table, and for a brief moment, Sandra forgot all about the tension she had been feeling. As Keanu made his way through the restaurant, people noticed him immediately. Not because he was a superstar, but because of the quiet aura he carried. He moved with grace, nodding politely when a couple of diners recognized him and whispered his name. Unlike many celebrities who would rush to their seats, Keanu always acknowledged people with kindness. That was one of the many reasons Sandra admired him. When he reached her table, he leaned down slightly and gave her a gentle hug. Sandra felt her shoulders relax. She hadn't realized how much tension she had been holding until that moment. "How's the evening so far?" he asked softly, his voice calm and steady. Sandra forced a smile, not wanting to burden him immediately. "It's fine," she replied, but Keanu, being who he was, could sense the truth behind her words. The waiter, who had been avoiding Sandra with coldness all evening, suddenly appeared nearby carrying menus for another table. His eyes flicked toward Keanu and something shifted in his expression. For the first time there was hesitation, almost as if he realized that things were about to change. Keanu noticed it too. His sharp instincts told him that something was off. He pulled out a chair and sat across from Sandra. His eyes scanned her face, noticing the small signs of unease, the way her fingers tapped lightly against the edge of the table, the way her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Tell me," he said softly, "what happened?" Sandra hesitated. She didn't want to sound dramatic. "It's nothing, really," she whispered, "just not the best service tonight." Keanu tilted his head slightly, his calm gaze urging her to continue. She sighed. "The waiter, he's been a little unkind." Keanu leaned back in his chair, processing her words carefully. He wasn't the type to jump to conclusions. He believed in fairness, but the look in Sandra's eyes was enough for him to know that she wasn't exaggerating. She had always been patient, always giving people the benefit of the doubt. If she felt hurt, then there was truly a reason. The waiter came back to their table holding a notepad. His tone was clipped as he asked Keanu what he would like to order. Keanu gave him a polite smile, but instead of answering immediately, he glanced at Sandra. "Did you get your water refill?" he asked her. His voice was gentle but carried an edge of concern. Sandra shook her head lightly, trying to dismiss it. "It's fine," she murmured. But Keanu's eyes shifted back to the waiter, who shifted uncomfortably under his calm stare. Something about Keanu's presence demanded honesty. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't need to. His calmness was powerful enough. The waiter mumbled an apology that sounded forced and walked away quickly to fetch a pitcher of water. Sandra lowered her eyes, embarrassed by the attention, but Keanu reached across the table and gave her hand a small squeeze. "You deserve respect," he said quietly. Always. Around them, the diners who had witnessed the earlier exchanges were watching with interest. Many of them admired how Keanu handled the moment, not with anger, but with quiet authority. His very presence seemed to shift the energy in the room. The tension that had weighed so heavily on Sandra just minutes before began to lift. Sandra felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. She wasn't used to being defended. She had built a reputation in Hollywood as a strong, independent woman, but in that moment, having someone stand beside her, someone who truly cared, made her feel less alone. She smiled at Keanu, this time a genuine smile that reached her eyes. Keanu leaned back again, picking up the menu as if nothing had happened. He didn't want to make the situation bigger than it was, but at the same time, his subtle actions had already spoken volumes. The restaurant staff, who had been watching nervously, straightened their posture, suddenly more attentive than before. It was as if Keanu's presence had reminded them of something they had forgotten: kindness, respect, and professionalism. Sandra took another sip of her water, which had now been refilled, and for the first time that evening, she felt the tightness in her chest ease. She knew the night wasn't over, and that there might still be challenges ahead, but she also knew she wasn't facing them alone. Keanu was here, and that made all the difference. The quiet strength he carried with him had already begun to change the course of the evening, and though Sandra didn't know it yet, The bold response he was about to make would leave not just her, but the entire restaurant stunned. Keanu sat across from Sandra, his calm eyes watching her carefully. He had already noticed the way she lowered her gaze, the way her smile looked forced, and he knew something inside her was unsettled. He wasn't a man who liked conflict, but he was also not the type to sit silently when someone he cared about was being treated unfairly. The waiter returned with a pitcher of water, this time moving slower, perhaps realizing the atmosphere around the table had shifted. He poured into Sandra's glass but did so without making eye contact. Keanu watched quietly, his patience steady. When the waiter turned to leave, Keanu's voice cut through the air. "Calm yet firm." "Excuse me," he said. The room fell into a hush, as if everyone knew something important was about to happen. The waiter stopped, his shoulders stiff. "Yes?" He replied in a tone that was still clipped. Keanu leaned slightly forward, not raising his voice but making sure his words carried weight. "I couldn't help but notice the way you've been speaking to my friend," he said slowly. "She deserves the same respect as anyone else here." The words were simple, but the effect was powerful. Conversations around the restaurant paused. Forks were lowered, glasses stayed on the table. Everyone's attention turned toward the exchange. The waiter shifted uncomfortably, clearly not expecting to be called out. "I didn't mean anything by it," he muttered. Trying to brush it off, Keanu's expression stayed calm. His voice didn't rise, but there was a strength in it that couldn't be ignored. "Maybe you didn't mean it," he continued. "But words and actions matter. The way you've been treating her is not the way anyone should be treated." His tone was steady. Not angry, not aggressive, but firm enough to leave no space for argument. Sandra sat quietly, her chest tightening with emotion. She wasn't used to people standing up for her like this. She had always fought her own battles, choosing silence over confrontation. But hearing Keanu speak out for her with such dignity made her eyes well with gratitude. She wanted to stop him, to say it wasn't necessary, but deep down she knew it was. His words were not just for her. They were for everyone in that room. The waiter's face turned red, caught between embarrassment and defensiveness. "Look, I'm just busy. I didn't mean to come off rude," he said quickly. But Keanu shook his head slightly, his calm gaze still locked on the man. "Being busy is not an excuse to forget kindness," he replied. "Everyone here is a guest. Everyone deserves respect, no matter who they are." The silence that followed was heavy, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with the weight of truth. The other diners sat frozen, their eyes wide. Some nodded slowly, as if agreeing with every word. Sandra felt the energy shift completely. The humiliation she had carried only minutes ago was melting away, replaced by a quiet pride. Keanu leaned back in his chair after speaking. His message had been delivered, not with anger but with authority, the kind of authority that comes from a lifetime of humility and respect. He didn't need to raise his voice, his calmness was his power. The waiter, clearly shaken, mumbled a soft apology, this time more genuine than before. He promised to correct his behavior and quickly left the table, trying to escape the eyes that now followed him. The restaurant buzzed quietly again, but it was different now. The guests were whispering, not about Sandra, but about Keanu, about the way he had defended his friend without aggression, without arrogance but with undeniable strength. Sandra exhaled deeply, her shoulders dropping as if a weight had been lifted. She turned to Keanu, her voice soft but filled with emotion. "You didn't have to do that," she said. He smiled faintly, his eyes kind. "Of course I did," he answered. "Respect isn't optional, and you deserve nothing less." Her heart swelled, not just from his words but from the sincerity behind them. She had always admired Keanu for his simplicity, for the way he treated everyone equally. But seeing him speak up in such a graceful way reminded her of why people loved him so much. Not just as an actor, but as a human being. The diners nearby began nodding to Sandra, as if silently showing their support. A woman at a corner table gave her a small smile, and an older gentleman raised his glass in her direction. It was as if Keanu's words had given everyone permission to acknowledge the truth they had all seen, but didn't know how to confront. Sandra felt her cheeks warm, this time not from humiliation but from gratitude. She was touched not only by Keanu's defense but by the way he had done it, without shaming, without shouting, simply reminding the world of something so basic yet so often forgotten. The evening continued, but the atmosphere had changed. The staff became more attentive, not just to Sandra and Keanu, but to every table. The respect and care that should have been there from the start returned, as if the entire restaurant had learned a lesson in that very moment. Sandra looked across the table at Keanu. Her eyes shining, she whispered softly, "You always know what to say." He chuckled lightly. "Sometimes it's not about saying much," he replied. "It's about saying what matters." For a few seconds after Keanu spoke, the restaurant was silent. It wasn't the kind of silence that made people feel awkward. It was the kind that made everyone listen. Like the whole room had been reminded of something important. The quiet strength in his voice still lingered in the air, and no one wanted to break that moment too quickly. Sandra sat at the table, feeling the shift all around her just minutes ago. She had been holding back her discomfort, trying not to let others notice her humiliation, but now the energy in the room had completely changed. She could feel dozens of eyes looking not with pity, but with admiration. People had witnessed the way Keanu stood up for her, and they were moved. At a nearby table, a couple who had been whispering earlier now exchanged looks of respect. The woman leaned closer to her partner and said softly, "That was incredible." The man nodded, his eyes still fixed on Keanu across the room. A family with 2 children sat quietly. Even the kids seemed to sense something important had happened. The father lifted his glass slightly in acknowledgement, a silent gesture of approval. The staff behind the counter, who had also noticed the tension earlier, were now standing straighter. They glanced at each other nervously, realizing that their colleague's behavior had not only embarrassed Sandra, but had put the entire restaurant's reputation on the line. One of the younger waitresses whispered to another, "Did you hear how he said it?" Calm but so strong. They both nodded, realizing that kindness and respect weren't just rules, they were values. Keanu himself didn't seem fazed by the attention. He leaned back in his chair, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. For him, speaking up was natural. He didn't see it as a heroic act, he saw it as the right thing to do. Yet for the people around him, it was unforgettable. Sandra's heart softened as she watched the reactions of those nearby. It was as if Keanu's simple words had touched everyone in the room. She noticed a woman at the far corner smiling warmly at her, almost as if to say, "You're not alone." Another diner gave her a small nod of encouragement. These little gestures filled her with relief. The sting of humiliation was slowly being replaced with gratitude. The waiter, meanwhile, had returned to the back of the restaurant. Clearly shaken, his earlier arrogance was gone. Replaced by unease, he realized that everyone had witnessed his behavior, and Keanu's calm rebuke had left him exposed. The once confident steps he had taken between tables were now hesitant. His colleagues looked at him with a mix of disappointment and warning. They knew that in a place where respect was expected, his behavior had crossed a line. As the evening continued, conversation slowly returned. But the tone of the room was different. People were still whispering about what they had seen. Some diners quietly shared their admiration for Keanu's response, saying things like, "That's real class," or, "He didn't even raise his voice, but it was so powerful." The room carried an energy of respect, as if everyone was reminded that kindness was not just about good manners, it was about human dignity. Sandra leaned toward Keanu, her voice quiet but filled with emotion. "They're all watching you," she whispered. He gave her a small smile. "They're not watching me," he said gently. "They're watching the truth." His words made her eyes soften. She realized that he never sought attention. He never wanted to be the center of the story. His only concern was that she felt safe, respected, and valued. The room itself seemed lighter now. The tension that had once hung over Sandra like a shadow was gone, replaced with admiration for the bond between her and Keanu. People were no longer focused on the rude waiter or the awkwardness of the situation. They were inspired by what they had just witnessed. Sandra felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, not from sadness but from the overwhelming wave of gratitude. She was grateful for Keanu, grateful for the strangers who silently supported her, and grateful that what could have been a night of pain had turned into something meaningful. She whispered softly, "Thank you." Keanu only squeezed her hand gently and replied, "Always." The guests continued their meals, but the story was already spreading. At one table, a young man typed something quickly into his phone, probably sharing the moment with friends. At another, a woman shook her head in disbelief, saying, "You don't see that kind of respect anymore." It was clear that the night would not be forgotten easily. Sandra took another bite of her food, and this time it tasted better. The bitterness that had filled her earlier was gone. She looked across the table at Keanu and thought about how rare it was to find people like him in the world. People who spoke less but meant more. People whose quiet actions changed entire rooms. The reaction of the room wasn't just about admiration for a famous actor. It was about witnessing a reminder of something simple yet powerful. Everyone in that restaurant walked away with the same thought. That respect is not a privilege for the few, but a right for everyone. And while Sandra didn't say it out loud, she knew that this moment, this evening, would remain in her memory forever. Not because of the waiter's cruelty, but because of Keanu's courage, and the way the entire room had responded with silent agreement. Sandra sat back in her chair, her heart still racing from the way the evening had unfolded. A short time ago she had felt small, humiliated, and almost invisible, but now, because of Keanu, everything felt different. The heaviness inside her chest had lifted, replaced by a quiet sense of relief and warmth. She turned her eyes toward him, studying the calm expression on his face, and she realized just how much his presence meant to her. She reached for her glass of water and took a slow sip. Not because she was thirsty, but because she needed a moment to collect herself. Her hands trembled slightly, but this time it wasn't from embarrassment. It was from the overwhelming wave of gratitude she felt. She placed the glass back down carefully and let out a small breath she didn't realize she had been holding. "Thank you," she whispered softly, her voice low but filled with emotion. Keanu looked at her with his usual gentle smile, tilting his head slightly as if to say she didn't need to thank him. "You don't ever have to thank me," he replied, his voice steady and kind. "Respect isn't a favor. It's a right." Sandra felt her throat tighten at his words. She had known Keanu for years, worked alongside him, laughed with him, shared memories on film sets and outside them, but moments like these reminded her why their bond was so special. He wasn't just a friend. He was someone who truly saw her for who she was, not as a famous actress, but as a human being. She thought back to the way he had spoken up, calm yet powerful. She could still hear the echo of his words in her head, and she realized just how rare it was to find people who carried such strength without ego. She smiled faintly and said, "You always know what to say?" He chuckled softly, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Sometimes you don't need many words," he answered. "You just need the right ones." Her chest filled with warmth. She knew he was right. It wasn't the length of his speech that had changed the room. It was the honesty in it, the sincerity that could not be ignored. Sandra leaned forward slightly, resting her elbow on the table and her chin on her hand. She studied him like she had done many times before, trying to understand how someone could carry so much humility despite the fame. Keanu noticed her gaze and raised an eyebrow. "What?" he asked lightly. She shook her head and smiled. "Nothing," she said. "I'm just grateful." He gave her hand a gentle squeeze across the table. "I'm just glad you're smiling again," he replied, and it made her eyes soften even more. Around them, the restaurant had settled back into its usual rhythm, but the memory of what had happened still lingered in the air. A few diners occasionally glanced in their direction, smiling as if to share in Sandra's relief. The same people who had earlier looked at her with pity now looked at her with respect, and she knew that was because of Keanu. Sandra picked up her fork and took another bite of pasta. The food tasted better now, as though the bitterness of the evening had been washed away. She realized how much her mood had changed simply because she knew she wasn't alone. That was the true gift of Keanu's friendship. It wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic rescues, it was about his steady presence, his quiet way of reminding her that she mattered. She leaned back again, her smile genuine this time, and said softly, "Do you know what I admire most about you?" Keanu tilted his head curiously. "What's that?" he asked. Sandra paused for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "You don't try to be a hero," she said, "but somehow, you always end up being one anyway." Keanu laughed softly, shaking his head. "I'm no hero," he said. "I just try to do what feels right." Sandra's eyes glistened with unshed tears. Not of sadness, but of gratitude. She knew he meant every word. That was who he was, never chasing glory, never looking for recognition, just living with quiet integrity. For Sandra, the evening that had started with discomfort was ending with a reminder of why true friendship was priceless. Fame, money, and success could never replace the comfort of having someone who stood beside you when it mattered most. She realized she would carry this night in her memory forever, not because of the waiter's cruelty, but because of Keanu's kindness. The gratitude she felt wasn't just for what he said to the waiter. It was for everything he had always been in her life. A steady presence, a safe place, a reminder that even in a world full of superficiality, real kindness still existed. She reached across the table once more, squeezed his hand tightly and whispered again, "Thank you, for everything." Keanu gave her that same gentle smile, the one that always seemed to calm her heart. "Always," he replied simply. And with that single word, Sandra knew that no matter what challenges life would bring, she would never have to face them alone. The restaurant slowly returned to its usual rhythm, but the memory of what had happened remained fresh in everyone's mind. It was not just another evening anymore. It had become a night that people knew they would remember for a long time. Sandra sat quietly at the table, her heart still warm with gratitude. Keanu's calm defense had not only changed the way she felt, but it also changed the entire atmosphere of the place. The waiter, who had been sharp and dismissive earlier, now moved through the restaurant with a new caution. His steps were slower, his tone softer, and he made sure to treat every table with care. It was clear that Keanu's words had left an impression on him. The arrogance was gone, replaced with a kind of humility that came when someone realized they had crossed a line. Other diners continued their meals, but whispers filled the room. People spoke quietly to each other, not about the food or the weather, but about what they had witnessed. "Did you see how he handled it?" One man whispered to his wife. "He didn't raise his voice, but he still made his point," the woman nodded, her eyes drifting back toward Sandra and Keanu's table. "That's real respect," she said softly. Sandra noticed these small reactions, and it made her heart swell. For so long she had carried the weight of fame, often feeling judged, watched, and sometimes treated unfairly. Tonight had begun as one of those painful reminders of how cruel people could be, but now it had transformed into something else. Instead of feeling ashamed, she felt proud. Not just of Keanu, but of the way the whole room had absorbed the lesson. Keanu, as always, sat calmly, sipping his water as though nothing extraordinary had happened. He never carried himself like a man who had just changed the energy of an entire restaurant. He didn't seek credit or recognition. To him, it was simple. Someone he cared about had been disrespected, and he had spoken up. That was enough. Sandra leaned closer and whispered, "I think everyone here learned something tonight." Keanu gave her a small smile. "Sometimes people just need a reminder," he replied gently. "Kindness isn't complicated, it's a choice." His words sank deep into her heart. She realized that he was right. The waiter had made his choice earlier, but tonight he had also been given a chance to learn from it, and maybe he would carry that lesson with him forever. The night carried on, and laughter slowly returned to the tables. But the respect in the air was stronger now. Diners treated the staff with kindness, and the staff in return worked with more care. It was as though one small moment of truth had spread silently across the room, reminding everyone of the value of dignity. Sandra finished her meal, and when the bill arrived, Keanu insisted on paying. He placed the money down quietly. Without making a scene, the waiter returned, his eyes lowered, and offered an apology again, this time directly to Sandra. "I'm sorry for earlier," he said softly. "I was wrong." Sandra looked at him, her heart softened. She could have ignored him or responded with coldness, but instead, she gave him a kind smile. "Thank you," she replied simply. That was all that needed to be said. When Sandra and Keanu stood up to leave, the room shifted again. A few diners smiled at them. Some even gave small nods of respect. It wasn't because they were celebrities. It was because everyone had seen a true example of kindness and strength. Sandra walked toward the door beside Keanu, feeling lighter than when she had walked in. Outside, the night air was cool and fresh. The city lights glowed softly, and Sandra paused for a moment. Taking a deep breath, she looked at Keanu and said, "I'll never forget tonight." He glanced at her, his eyes calm and warm. "Neither will they," he said quietly. Gesturing toward the restaurant behind them, Sandra smiled, realizing he was right. The lesson of the evening wasn't just for the waiter, or even for her. It was for everyone who had witnessed the moment. Respect was not about status, fame, or wealth. It was about treating each person with the same dignity, no matter who they were. And sometimes, it only took one person with quiet courage to remind the world of that truth. Sandra linked her arm with Keanu's as they walked down the street together. The night no longer felt heavy. It felt alive with meaning. She thought about how blessed she was to have a friend who would always stand by her, not with anger, but with kindness, not with pride, but with humility. The people inside the restaurant would go home that night with a story to tell. They would remember how a famous actor had defended his friend, but more importantly, they would remember the lesson behind it. That respect is simple, that kindness is powerful, and that silence in the face of cruelty is never the answer. Sandra knew that her fame might fade one day, and so might the stories people told about her. But this night would remain in her heart forever, not because of the disrespect she had faced, but because of the bold yet gentle way Keanu had turned it around. It was proof that even in the smallest places, at the most ordinary times, extraordinary lessons could be found.